There are many things that millennials don't do, and perhaps the most surprising is that they don't have sex at the same rate as generations, despite the technological advances in communication that enable them to meet more people. However, statistics indicate a decline in marriage or association rates within a long-term relationship among millennials, which means a decline in sex rates. Economists, psychologists, writers and researchers have a special view. What does the sex situation around the world look like in general, and in the Arab world in particular? What are the causes of the decline in sex among millennials? From 1991 to 2017, a survey on youth behavior conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that the proportion of high school students who had sex fell from 54% to 40%, meaning that within a generation, sex has shifted from one that most high school students did not. Mostly. Over the past few years, Jean M. Twenge, a professor of psychology at San Diego State University, researches how and why American sexuality is declining. In a series of press articles and in her latest book, Jean noted that today's young people have less sex than their peers in the previous two generations, and that people in their early 20s are now less likely to have sex than their peers of the same age in 2012. Previous generations. In addition, 15% reported that they had not had sex since they reached adulthood. Jan also found that from the late 1990s to 2014s, the average rate dropped from 62 times a year to 54 times, according to General Social Survey data. This decrease may seem unnoticeable, but at the national level it means a significant reduction in the rate of sex. As of 2016, sex rates have fallen even further in the next 2 years, says Jane after reading the latest General Social Survey data.
Some meetings question aspects of Jan's analysis, and others say that the source of their data is not entirely suitable for sex research, although it is highly regarded. However, none of them came up with evidence against the idea that an adult in 2018 had sex at a lower rate than his peers in previous decades. No one doubted that this reality was not commensurate with the public perception, which most of us believed was still occurring at a normal rate, and that people were having much more sex than they actually did. Helen Fisher, a woman who studies love and sex and participates in an annual survey of more than 5,000 single Americans in America, says data suggests that sex rates are low. Helen, like many other experts, attributed the low gender to the low rates of marriage among young people. For a quarter of a century, fewer married persons had been married, and those who married had postponed it until later. Initially, many observers believe that the low demand for marriage is due to the increasing trend towards premarital sex and cohabitation between unmarried couples without the need for marriage. However, the proportion of people living together without marriage has not increased enough to compensate for the decline in marriage rates, with about 60% of adults under the age of 35 now living without a husband or partner. In addition, 1 in 3 adults in this age group lives with their parents, making this type of lifestyle the most common among that group. While people living with a romantic partner have sex more than others, it is clear that living with your parents is not the best option for your sex life. But that does not explain from the beginning why young people are not inclined to have long-term relationships in which they have sex at a greater rate. Masturbation is over sex. Alarm bells are ringing in Japan. Not only is Japan one of the world's largest producers and consumers of pornography, but it is developing entirely new types of pornography, as well as its global leadership in the design of sex dolls. Nevertheless, Japan faces fertility problems and reproductive rates is living in the midst of a population crisis that threatens its being, making it the subject of a study on the dangers of non-sex. In 2005, 1/3 of Japanese singles between the ages of 18 and 34 were virgins. By 2015, the proportion in this age group had risen to 43%, and the proportion of those who said they did not intend to get married had also increased. The situation is made worse when it is found that even with marriage this is not a guarantee of repeated sex, as 47% of married Japanese have not had sex in at least a month. Japan, on the other hand, is working on the invention of modern methods of sexual arousal, which are not interested in old-fashioned sex practices involving more than one person. For example, a report published in The Economist entitled "Japan's Sex Industry Has Become Less Sexual" described onakura shops, where men pay for masturbation in front of female employees who watch it in the process. The article also explained that because many young people see the idea of sex as boring and tiring, the services that make masturbation more enjoyable are booming and popular there.
Sex in the Arab world differs in situations and agrees on double standards. The sexuality of Arabs is a hidden mystery for scientists and policymakers, says Shirin al-Fiqi, an immunologizer, journalist and author of Sex in the Castle, which holds Egyptian and Canadian citizenship. An Egyptian gynecologist describes sex in the Arab world as the opposite of football. Between 30 and 60% of young men said they had had sexual relations before marriage, while more than 80% of young women said they didn't. She says, asking the question, who did that percentage of these young men have sex with? Shirin also said that at least 70% of men said it was acceptable for them to have sex before marriage, compared to less than 30% of women. But the majority of men said they wanted to marry a virgin. The problem in the Arab region lies in the deep gap between what appears to be what is happening in reality. It's not that Arabs don't practice what people all over the world do, but they're reluctant to talk openly about it. Shirin adds that sex work is flourishing in the Arab region, but at the same time people do not want to admit to having premarital sex, because women are expected to be virgins on their wedding night, describing it as a double standard. Shirin al-Fiqi's book is the first serious attempt to shape sexual intimacy in the rapidly changing Arab world, exploring the essence of contemporary sexuality in the Arab world, from Tunisia to Egypt and Saudi Arabia to Qatar. The exact degree of that relationship cannot be determined from radicalism to emancipation. There are many differences within each country, as well as a lack of scientific studies and research. However, the author says, there is some information about certain situations. For example, the relatively more open societies are Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. Lebanon is also relatively open, and al-Fiqi adds that Lebanese students should be the most studied segment of Arab society as a whole, when it comes to studying sexual behavior, while Jordan is open to issues such as honor killings, which are a real problem there. We have been through a dark period in the Arab region since the 1950s, when the region has experienced a glut in politics and economic and cultural thought. Sex was part of that. People have become incredibly conservative, not only Muslims, but also Christian and Jewish conservatives,
who have encapsulated sex with religion and used it as a tool of control. This creates a whole climate in which everything is forbidden and flawed.
There are many causes and the result is one. Why are millennials having sex at lower rates? In a detailed article published in The Atlantic, the December issue of 2018, author Kate Julian listed the reasons why young people are reluctant to have sex, which included parental pressure that some teenagers postpone the beginning of their sex life in order to please many parents, and educators and clergy. Parents are increasingly concerned about their children's educational and economic prospects, and parents are urging their children to focus on building their high school and college credentials, rather than investing in romantic relationships. In addition, young people may have less sex because their ability to provoke has been undermined in several ways, including digital dispersion between means of communication, sleep deprivation, a negative image of their bodies, and other sources of inhibition that can stand in the way of sexual gratification. Dating apps are also among the reasons. While it may seem that their frequent presence may seem to make it easier to find a dating partner, but it doesn't necessarily happen that way. Kate found that Tinder, for example, tends to be a huge waste of time, as it takes an average of more than 60 attempts to get one match, and if that match is found, many of those matches eventually don't result in text messages being exchanged between the two parties. Kate says opportunities aren't evenly distributed in those apps. It's the people with the most attractive images who find dating apps very useful. If dating apps are largely ineffective, and people are hard to ask, even if you've known them a little before, it's also going to be difficult to find sex opportunities. In an article on the Today website, social psychologist Bella DiPolo adds that the prevalence of anxiety and depression among current younger generations may also be one of the reasons for the decline in sex, and that some antidepressants can undermine libido. Alison Jurager, an economist and author of An Economist Walks into a Brothel, says that the rate of youth decline for sex can be determined by examining the risks. According to Alison, the basis for attrition is a concept called risk-free assets, which form the basis of people's decisions. For millennials, who have been described as more risk-averse than previous generations, the risk-free final dividend is not leaving home, which ultimately led to a decline in sex. People no longer need to leave the house to find entertainment, as everyone can now live a kind of entertainment without risking leaving the house, thanks to almost limitless TV and video games, says Alison. According to Alison, this excess of entertainment options means that people are satisfied with those options available at home, enough to give up actual interactions. For people who are still looking for a partner, video games and live streaming offer something more valuable than a satisfying and risk-free home experience, even if you're alone. This is in addition to the idea that relationships are inherently risky, which eventually leads young people to stay at home, and dating rates drop. However, Alison says, staying at home and not socializing can eventually lead to loneliness and anxiety, as well as a false sense of loyalty.